Good evening, everybody. My name is James Crabtree. I'm the director of the IISS Asia office here in Singapore, and we're gathered for the next hour and a half to talk about the topic everyone in the world of the IISS has been talking about for the last month or so, the new AUKUS security treaty between the United States, Australia, and Great Britain. We've gathered this evening a panel designed to look, in a sense, at this agreement from the point of view mostly of its originators. There are lots of different ways you can look at AUKUS from here in our region in Asia. Its shockwaves have spread out around the world, but what we thought we'd do is try and give a tour starting from Australia, going back through Europe and then to the United States, to try and look about a month on at the ramifications of this deal. Now the dust has settled a little bit, what the fallout has been, in particular in Europe and within the West, but also looking at the reaction in Asia, and then where it might go from here, both in terms of the deal itself and what it might mean for the other shifting array of new pacts, alliances, and partnerships that are predominating, particularly in Asian security against the backdrop of the rise of China. So to do this, I'm joined by four colleagues from the IISS Europe, speaking in the following order. So starting will be Ewan Graham, who's the Shangri-La Dialogue Senior Fellow here in Singapore, and he will look predominantly at this from the Australian point of view. We'll then move to our newly opened IISS Europe office in Berlin, whose director, Ben Schreier, will speak maybe a little bit about Australia, given he recently moved back to Berlin from Australia, but mostly about Europe. Then we'll move to London, where Sarah Rain, who's a consulting senior fellow at the Institute, will give mostly the UK perspective. And then we'll shift to Washington, DC, where David Gordon, who's a senior advisor for geoeconomics and strategy at the Institute, will tell us how this is looking from the Biden administration. And then having given this tour of the various Western perspectives, we'll dive in to how the agreement will change in the future. The running order is pretty simple. I've asked each of the panelists to speak for about 4 minutes at the beginning, just to give a few points from their particular point of view. Then we'll have a moderated discussion for about 20 minutes, 25 minutes, and then we'll turn it over to audience Q&A. We've got a large audience here this evening, which reflects the considerable interest in this topic amongst audiences for the IISS here in Asia, in Europe, and in North America. So we'll try and take as many questions as we can. You can put those questions in the Q&A function, and I'll get to as many of them as I can, and I might even pick up a few in the chat. If you do want to leave a question, please let us know what your name is and give your affiliation, so your job title and where you're coming from. So with that, many thanks for joining us. I think this is going to be a great discussion, and I'll start by turning over to Dr. Ewan Graham. So Ewan, first over to you.
Thank you, James. Good evening, everyone from Singapore. I'm going to speak about the Australian role and perspective on AUKUS. Although I'm based here in Asia, I'm not going to talk in my prepared remarks about the Asian reaction, but that's something that I imagine there will be interest in, and I'm very happy to move to that and address it in the discussion phase. Australia is the smallest of the three participating states in the new technology sharing arrangement. But I think it's the appropriate place to start, because Australia can be viewed, if you like, as the instigator of AUKUS via its decision to upgrade to a nuclear submarine, and is the most directly affected state in terms of its own defense and security. It's also appropriate to start with Australia, as the new arrangement is meant to focus on Indo-Pacific security. That may sound like a statement of the obvious, but the events of the last couple of weeks, at least, have also focused things very much on a transatlantic and European lens. But I believe it's important to understand that on first principles, this is really about this region and Asian security. And essentially, the technology sharing agreement led by the submarine deal, is intended to enable Australia to make a defense capability contribution to regional deterrence and the balance of power. Deciding to terminate an Australian $90 billion contract with France's naval group was obviously not done lightly in Canberra. So what was the primary driver for that dramatic decision? It was primarily strategic. That's also important to remember. That this was framed in the context of a declining regional security environment in which China's increasing military capability, but also its intentions have become increasingly hostile, including focused on Australia itself as the recipient of a targeted and overt economic coercion campaign for the last year. Not military, but nonetheless coercive and hostile in nature. So I think that supplied two key ingredients of capability and intention in the Australian government's mind. This isn't new. It was clearly signaled in the July 2020 Defence Strategic Update, which I wrote about for the Institute at the time, and which committed Australia to acquiring long-range strike capability, greater lethality, and a self-reliant deterrent, albeit of the non-nuclear variety. Firstly, before AUKUS, the Australian Defence Force had already moved some way down that path, acquiring more missile capabilities for all of its services. And somewhat lost in the noise around AUKUS itself, there was a very significant announcement that Australia was acquiring Tomahawk land attack cruise missiles, which will go, at least to start with, on the surface fleet, and other long-range, extended-range air-to-surface missiles. But all of this is becoming much more pointy-ended than Australia has traditionally been, and it's a shift towards a more offensively inclined, you could say, military role. Secondly, it was also clear and public knowledge that the submarine contract was in deep trouble. One only had to read the papers in Australia to see that, or to listen to parliamentary testimony. It wasn't something that was below the surface. That was over delays, costs, and value share. But at some point in 2020, Australia clearly began planning for Plan B, and the trigger event, which I think is significant, looking at the origins of the AUKUS arrangement, was apparently an approach by the Australian Chief of Navy to his British counterpart on a visit to Australia. So it started from Australia to the UK, and then the United States came in to give its blessing, if you like, as the third party. It's safe to assume, I think, that the UK and Australia reached at least a basic agreement. There was a viable pathway to cooperating on a future nuclear submarine together, and that lit the fuse on the AUKUS arrangement. The capability upgrade that a nuclear submarine offers is significant. Australia operates conventionally powered submarines, but when these do eventually come online, and that's a long wait of 15 years or perhaps more, it will give Australia a power projection role, and its mission will be rather different. It'll be one of, if you like, dealing with the problem at source. The role of an attack nuclear submarine is to go and sink ships where they're most concentrated and vulnerable, close to their home bases. And if those future submarines themselves have a land attack capability, they may also attack those bases. That's not to say that that's going to happen, but you can see that the logic behind it is basically to give China's leaders something to think about at that rather basic level. And although there are only 8 boats that are planned, it will coincide at a time when the United States' own submarine nuclear fleet will reach a historic nadir in the early 2030s. So it'll be a useful addition, I think, from the US point of view, You can see that it fits within an overall alliance context. So I think it should be seen in the context not just of a standalone agreement, but in a fairly well-prepared and publicly telegraphed change in the Australian defence posture towards a more self-reliant deterrent capability, and also a change in alliance posture. One other thing that happened in the weeds of the AUKUS announcement was the 2+2 meeting of Australian and US defence and foreign ministers, and likely to flow from that is a significant augmentation of the US military presence and access to Australia, including probably more nuclear submarines that will start to operate from Western Australia, and into the bargain help Australia to get its training pipeline and to kickstart its own nuclear program. There is, however, I think, a very serious capability gap question that opens up, given the longer timeline even than the French deal. If it's right and these submarines do start entering service only from about 2038 at the earliest, then at that point Australia will be relying on 6 diesel-powered conventional submarines, which will have been upgraded, but they'll be close to the end of their service life and based on a 50-year-old hull. And if that's China's window of opportunity, then one can see that AUKUS may be a lot of fanfare, but rather late on delivering the effects that it intends to do, and potentially in a way that they won't count when they're most needed. One final point, I know I've gone over my 4 minutes, but I think just going away from the military aspects of this, but I think Australia, in the Australian debate, the UK role in AUKUS has tended to sort of been dealt with in parentheses, and there are understandable reasons for that. But I do think it's worth highlighting that for a small country like Australia, whether it was by design or by accident, it's rather useful to have the UK in there as a form of subtle leverage in its own alliance relations. And I think that that's something that we can also explore in our speakers who focus next, including my colleague, Sarah.
Thank you, Ewan. I'll come back to you with a few questions on Australia after everybody else has spoken, but let me now move from Singapore to Berlin. So Ben Schreier joins us from the conference room of the newly opened IISS Europe office, and is unusually well placed, having lived in Australia for a decade or more and now back in the heart of Europe to give a view, perhaps touching on the Australian reaction if there's more to be said after Ewan has spoken, but predominantly looking at the discord that this has created within Europe itself. So Ben, over to you.
Well, thank you, James, and good afternoon from Berlin. It's not much to say in response to add to Ewan's excellent comments. Maybe just 2 points. One, to reiterate his point, which is that I think it's absolutely critical and contrary to some rather distorted debate, that this was a sovereign decision by Australia to terminate the program, and it was not instigated by the United States for the United Kingdom, and for all the reasons that Ewan pointed out. The only other thing that I wanted to mention is that this decision, at least in my view, is also a testimony to the fact that in this age of ever-growing US-China strategic competition, Australia has chosen its side, and it's not China. There has been a long-standing debate in Australia whether there was such a choice to make. And of course, up until this day, Australian government say that there is no choice between the United States and China, but I think this decision rather points the other way. And I would also say that in this environment, major arms procurement decisions in Australia will probably increasingly be much more than simply a defense industrial contractual arrangement between two more countries, but rather will be taken within an assessment of how much the partner's strategic outlook on China also aligns with Australia's view on that main challenger. And with that, let me turn to some of the Europeans' perspectives, and James asked about the reaction. I mean, everyone has read about the French reactions, being rather furious, disappointed, and even vowing retaliation. But I think the interesting thing to note is that apart from a critical statement by the European Union, there was not so much support forthcoming for France and by other European powers. Yes, the German government or the German foreign minister issued a statement, but that statement was rather half-hearted, and it seems to accept behind closed doors, Berlin seemed to accept that Australia's strategic rationale for the decision. And obviously, Berlin was also watching with some surprise France's unilateral announcement of a Franco-Greek defense pact not long after the AUKUS decision was announced. Moreover, other European countries, for instance, Denmark, but also Sweden, were even somewhat openly supportive for AUKUS, or didn't provide any support for the French position. Because I'm based in Berlin, I think it's also interesting maybe for people who have turned in to note that as the AUKUS, shall we say, saga was going on, the frigate Bayern, the German frigate Bayern, arrived just a few days ago in Darwin, and the German Ministry of Defense, but also the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, made a big splash out of this. Germany also, only one day after the AUKUS announcement, signed an agreement on military space cooperation with Australia, and the German Air Force is gearing up to participate in an air combat exercise, Pitch Black, at the beginning of next year. So all of this to say that from a European perspective, or from the perspective of some European powers, you can also see this as an opportunity. As you mentioned, for instance, there might be a life extension of the Collins-class submarine, and obviously there are at least two countries in Europe that would be in a prime position to bid for it, one being Sweden. All this just goes to show that I think there is no unified European position on AUKUS, let alone on how to go about this Indo-Pacific defense engagement. My other main point is that I think that also really amplifies that Europe's regional defense engagement in Indo-Pacific is increasingly caught between a rock and a hard place. That is a desire to show some engagement in the region, not least because of some defense and industrial interests on the one hand, and the desire to avoid a too confrontational approach with China on the other. And France's position, at least to some extent, also reflected this have the cake and eat it too approach. And so does the latest EU strategy on the Indo-Pacific, which emphasizes inclusivity and cooperation rather than recognizing strategic competition as the new working principle in the region. And this is all understandable, but I think it also risks limiting in the future a significant and meaningful European strategic role in the Indo-Pacific. The EU positions, at least to my mind, reflects more an ASEAN approach, which also, as you know, emphasizes inclusivity and a tendency to hedge. But even ASEAN wasn't united on the AUKUS decision, as you could see in the Philippine public statement, which showed strong support for AUKUS. So you might ask, you know, is the Philippines the new UK of ASEAN? Probably it's a bit too far to say that, but this goes to show that there is not one unified view. What does this all mean? I think AUKUS clearly is a reflection of increased power competition in the Indo-Pacific, and it will also tie the UK much more closely strategically to the region. Obviously, the cautious approach of other European powers does not prevent them from engaging in Indo-Pacific security, but they still seem to believe that somehow they can stay out of this great power game. Again, this is an understandable position, but I think it is one which is increasingly harder to sustain. And I think it is an increasingly a reality that European powers wishing to engage, that hard power will become a more important entry card for European countries if they then wish to play a key role in the Indo-Pacific. And I stop here. Thank you, James.
Thank you, Ben. So both of you, in a sense, have mentioned the UK's role in this, and so for that, let's turn to Sarah Rain in London in our kind of tour of the West in terms of its role in AUKUS and its views of it. So, how has this been looking in London? What's been the balance of feeling that this has been successful and concern about the after effects? Sarah, over to you.
Thank you very much, James. Yes, my job is to look at this deal from the perspective of what one French former diplomat called the fifth wheel of the carriage. Obviously, you know, this is a big moment for the UK, put crassly in terms of its global Britain rhetoric, but put more substantively in terms of putting sort of meat on the bone of their Indo-Pacific tilt that we saw in the integrated review relatively recently announced. And so what I'd like to do in my few minutes is not so much look at the deal itself, but take the deal as done and look at what will come next, what I would guess would come next from a UK policy perspective. Proactively, I think we'll see three things. Firstly, there's an awareness here in London that the UK will need to work hard to protect and develop its equities in this trilateral deal. And for an understanding of what some of those industrial equities look like, I would draw your attention to a really good piece by our maritime senior fellow for naval forces, Nick Childs, who's written a piece on this that you can find on the IISS website. I mean, realistically, I think there's an acceptance, as Ewan sort of has already highlighted, that Australia is going to be naturally focused on cultivating closer relations with DC, and that the UK can't sort of afford to take the positive step forward on industrial cooperation that this deal ought to herald for granted. That means, in policy terms, doubling down on bilateral relations between the UK and Australia. And it probably also means pushing quite hard on elements of the deal that go beyond submarine capability building into sort of areas of technology sharing. Secondly, whilst there's a sort of understanding that Australia will take the lead within the region, I think there is sort of a desire to ensure that this deal lands positively in Southeast Asia in particular. So there'll be close attention paid to reactions there. And I think that, for example, we saw Malaysia, who's a key partner for the UK in the FPDA, summon up not just one, but three coordinated statements in one day on AUKUS. And that obviously stands in slightly uncomfortable contrast with how difficult Malaysia has sometimes found it to put out coordinated statements on China's activities in the South China Sea. So I think, again, in policy terms, that means sort of wrapping AUKUS within a broader range of activities and outreach that deliberately focus on the UK's parallel non-hard power engagements. And I think one of the challenges coming up for the UK then will be, you know, that it will probably leave itself open to sort of allegations, if you like, of hypocrisy or sort of inconsistency. Because I think the third proactive policy thing we'll see is a concern to shut down any temptation, and I'm thinking of Paris here in particular, to exploit the hard power focus of AUKUS to develop a sort of French or more broadly European profile that sort of presents itself as a more sort of nuanced interlocutor. Because the concern is that there could be a narrative out there that somehow AUKUS, you know, and China are both in their different ways pushing a sort of polarizing agenda, and that there's a sort of more nuanced way to do business. And I think you actually even see some of the start of this in the testimony of French Foreign Minister Le Drian to his Senate, where he talks about how France will pursue a path that does not fuel tension and conflict, and where he sort of specifically talks about AUKUS, you know, in my opinion, personally wrongly, as an alliance that's based on a logic that systematizes confrontation. So again, I think the UK is going to have to try and shut down the space for that narrative to build, working with the US and Australia on that. But I do think that, as I say, is going to lead to policy choices that, for commentators at the more hawkish end of the spectrum, are going to question the sort of consistency of some of this. But if I was sitting looking at this in Southeast Asia, for example, I would see that as broadly good news when it comes to the UK's interest in developing commitments and engagements beyond the hard power agenda. Just to finish then with some thoughts on sort of mitigating policy, because I can see already in the questions there's something about how, how to convenience France. One of the questions has come up. And I think there is already an awareness that there are going to be mitigating actions taken on all sides, and that this is going to require some sort of management. So firstly, from a UK perspective, of course, there's an awareness that both the US and Australia are going to be anxious to find ways to make nice with France. We already have Tony Blinken and John Kerry jumping on a plane to Paris this week. And similarly, there's an understandable awareness that France is going to reach out to other partners and powers that aren't involved in AUKUS to develop its own initiatives. And that's all well and good, and actually to be encouraged and welcomed against the backdrop of shared interests in the Indo-Pacific security. But of course, from a UK perspective, it's going to want to limit the degree to which these understandable mitigations are going to brush up against the further development of its own interests in the region. And the UK is also, I think, going to have its own reassurance agenda with European partners. In the wake of its integrated review, there were some questions about the degree to which the Indo-Pacific tilt announced there meant that the UK continued to commit and prioritise regional European security issues. And I think that what we'll see as the carrier group returns from the Indo-Pacific into the Mediterranean will be a shifting in narrative now to emphasize not so much capability, or rather not just capability, but also towards sort of emphasizing engagement and partnership. There's clearly a particular mitigation challenge for the UK around France, where I think that the challenge will be more complicated than that faced by the US and Australia. And there are policy decisions you could imagine the UK taking to sort of make nice with France. The ones that I can most easily imagine don't actually really impinge on this seminar, because I think I can more easily imagine outreach in the Sahel or in the Gulf, for example, really than in the Indo-Pacific in the short term. But I think that the UK is going to be realistic that France is not going to allow bilateral UK-France ties to be so easily mended. And I think there is some understanding of this. And I do think it's really important, given the lineup we have here, not to minimize or sort of to fail to understand what French concerns really are. Because if you're sitting in Paris, you sort of, you've been dumped on this deal. You've been trying and you can't quite get into the Quad. You're not in the Five Eyes. And you're starting to sort of worry that there's a sort of Anglosphere security alliance that's forming, where France, despite all of its efforts, is in danger of being treated as a sort of second-class citizen. And so I do think, we mustn't minimize those sort of concerns, and that some serious outreach won't be easy to do. But I think one of the consequences we're going to see of this sort of perception is going to be a doubling down in French rhetoric and policy pushes on concepts of sort of EU strategic autonomy, particularly as we head into the French presidency of the EU early next year, and as we head up towards the re-election campaign of President Macron. But to finish off with, and I hope we get more chance to discuss France in the Q&A and in the discussions, but I think that the bottom line from the UK perspective is that the UK did this deal well aware that it was going to complicate relations with China, well aware that it was going to make its own sort of Indo-Pacific tilt more likely to be seen as somehow more sharply anti-China, well aware that there were going to be knock-on effects for relations elsewhere, most notably vis-a-vis France, but that ultimately it took the sort of calculated decision that these were frankly second-order concerns.
Excellent, thank you, Sarah. Okay, and so the last journey on our tour of the Tour de AUKUS is to Washington, where David Gordon has joined us very early in the morning. So thank you very much for that, David. I appreciate you getting up early to come join us. So how does this look from Washington, in particular within the context of attempts to craft a more coherent Indo-Pacific strategy than had previously been the case? So David, over to you.
Thanks a lot, James, and good to join all of my colleagues. Great discussion so far. So I do think that the administration has been looking for very concrete ways to highlight what it sees as its main national security orientation, and that is the increasing primacy of China as a rival, of strategic competition with China, and the significance of alliances within that. So the first example of that was the very early on resuscitation of the Quad concept, US, Japan, India, Australia. And now we see AUKUS coming. I think the timing was probably influenced by the need of the Biden administration to shift the focus away from Afghanistan as rapidly as possible. And this was a good opportunity to do this. So, I think this is really about two dimensions here. One is, as my colleagues talked about, enhancing Australia's ability to contribute to deterrence of China and to regional security more broadly. But I think the second piece, and it's important here, is to help Australia to what we might say, just say no to Chinese economic coercion. And I do think both of these elements are important here, both the military dimension, but also helping Australia, that has been perhaps the main target of Chinese economic coercion in the past couple of years. So I think beyond this, I think there's a real question of whether there is a shift in policy going on within the US administration away from what in effect has been the dominance of a focus on Northeast Asia among all recent administrations, to a more balanced approach that includes Southeast Asia, the South China Sea, and a broader geography. And I believe the answer to that is yes. Previous US administrations talked about Asia as if it was one place, but dealt with it as if it were two places. And I know early on in the Biden administration, there was a great fear, particularly in ASEAN and James, in your part of the world, that the Biden administration was moving even further in that direction. I think this really highlights what I believe to be a move in exactly the other direction. So I do think, and we've seen visits by both the Deputy Secretary of State and the Secretary of Defense to Southeast Asia. I do believe actually that we're entering into a new period of a greater concern with Southeast Asia. Now, the big question here is going to be, will there be a commercial economic component to US policy towards Southeast Asia? And that question was put in sharper focus by China's response to AUKUS being their request to enter into negotiations to join the CPTPP. And that in turn, I think has moved the needle at least a little bit here in Washington. I don't think we're on the verge of a policy shift here in Washington, but the needle has moved. A lot of attention has been paid in the last week or two to should the United States be part of CPTPP? Should it find some kind of an arrangement, if the answer is no, to get into at least some kind of a commercial, institutional, economic relationship vis-a-vis Southeast Asia? So I think that's going to be really, really important to watch. In terms of Europe, I agree very much with Ben and Sarah's views, and they reflect the views here in Washington. I think that you know there has been I think some concern around that there could have been a better process vis-a-vis the French in terms of consultation and discussions, but I don't think that the administration believes that the French are lost here in terms of influencing Europe in a way that distances itself sharply from the US on China. And of course, the context for that is the sharply deteriorating public opinion towards China, towards President Xi and his policies in Europe. So as Sarah mentioned, US diplomats are going to Paris today or tomorrow. You know, there will not be an easy changing of the rhetoric here, but I think for the United States, the point was the one that Sarah made, that there was really not a lot of support in Europe for the French position. So, you know, for the UK, I think the interesting question here is, might the Quad become the Quint? And of course, the key to that is Japan. And right now, the Japanese are not oriented towards that kind of a shift. The Japanese, of course, were the primary opponents in the G7 of Boris Johnson's efforts to expand that discussion and that grouping towards much more of a D10 type construct. Japan does not like that construct. So I do think that there are going to be some very interesting high politics here. But there's no question that I think for the US that this really marks a continuation of the upgrading of the relationship with both London and the long-term relationship with Canberra.
Thank you, David. Very good. Now, so we've already got a large number of questions coming in the Q&A function. I see our former colleague Corey Shaki asking one, and a few other friends. But if you would like to ask one, then please put them. I'm now going to fire a few questions at our panelists just to make sure that they're on their toes, as it were. I'm going to start with you. And could you tell us a little bit about, in a sense, the changing Australian justification for the deal? It seems that as Australia has, in a sense, had to cope with at least some limited amount of skepticism from the region, and the divisions that this has created within the West, that the way that Australia has described the deal might have changed a little bit to try and, as you say, sort of suck away some of the hype and focus more on the capabilities and the kind of long-term consistency in Australian policy. But can you tell us a little bit about how Australia has been coping with the fallout from this, and in a sense, how they're trying to manage this with their own partners in the region?
Sure, I can also fold in a brief reference to the domestic political situation, which was one of the questions asked of me in the chat box. But to deal with the regional situation first, well, I mean, there is a consultation high-level exercise that's currently taking place with an envoy sent by the Prime Minister to consult in Southeast Asia, and that shows, I think, an appropriate willingness to listen. That's always a sine qua non of Australian diplomacy in Southeast Asia. There is a long pattern to making statements and then having to kind of go and kiss and make up afterwards. So I think that's it's appropriate that that has already started, and that there will be a channel back. I mean, I think the bottom line of this is really it is about hard power. AUKUS is primarily a military technology sharing agreement. I think we've seen, however, an interesting division of labor incipiently emerging between AUKUS going towards that end and the Quad, with the recent meeting in Washington going the other way, so that it's dealing with the more broader public policy issues, which are less polarizing, less defense-oriented, such as climate change, vaccine diplomacy. I think that's quite a shrewd policy on the part of all the Quad nations, two of whom obviously are in the AUKUS arrangement. I think whether it was by design or by accident, Australia has benefited strangely from the focus being so much on the submarine deal and on the French reaction that the rest of the region has forgotten to be worried about the other stuff that Australia is acquiring, such as cruise missiles and long-range missiles, which in any other situation would normally provoke a storm, I think, of anxiety in Jakarta, most obviously, but in other parts of Southeast Asia. And the same is true of the increased US military posture, which is going to become much clearer, I think, over the coming months and years in Australia. That would also rattle the cage, I think, of many in Southeast Asia who see Australia through the lens of being the kind of southern pincer of an alliance network that tends to do Washington's bidding. Canberra so far doesn't seem to have had to deal with that. So the lightning rod effect of AUKUS has actually been strangely helpful. On the domestic front, I would just note that there is a long-standing tradition of bipartisan support for defense policy. The Labour leader and foreign policy spokesman did put out a statement saying that they welcomed AUKUS, they were prepared to work with it. They were critically briefed before the announcement came out, so they weren't caught entirely blindsided. They also predictably criticized the government for pulling out of its own submarine deal, and I think that's justified to some extent, although the tale of woe on submarine development has both parties' fingerprints all over it, going back as far as 2009. And the fact that Australia is going to be left with this rather worrisome capability gap before the nuclear submarines come online is unfortunately because governments of both stripes were unable to settle on a successor program and to finance it when the regional security situation was more benign.
There's a lot of questions coming in. I just want to ask a few more. So partly about before we go back to David and think about the US, I want to ask a sort of set of questions about where the European discord goes next, to Ben and to Sarah. So Sarah, maybe starting with you. You said that, one needs to take very seriously how this looks from Paris in particular. But both to you and then to Ben, I mean, where do you think this discord is most likely to manifest itself, as in where will this the unhappiness and division that this deal has created be felt most keenly? Is it going to be felt in the Indo-Pacific, or is the backwash of this really going to be felt in Europe and within the transatlantic alliance in areas that are not related to the Indo-Pacific? So Sarah, do you want to give us your sense of that, and then Ben?
Yes, absolutely. So just to sort of highlight the point about taking French concerns seriously, there's the sort of substance of it that I've already talked about, but there is also just the timing of it, in terms of, this was the day that basically we all knew that the EU's Indo-Pacific strategy, which France had a large hand in, was coming out, and we couldn't even find a way to sort of name check that in the AUKUS announcement. It was the day in which French special forces actually killed the leader of Al-Qaeda in the Greater Sahara. That should have been really big news for Macron. And one of the questions here that came up was about the degree to which we think on the panel that Macron's reactions were sort of informed by his domestic political requirements. And, with an election coming up in particular and challenges from the far right, these sort of headlines matter, and you can see some of that in the sort of forefronting of an emotional response to some of this. In terms of where the reactions will play out, I mean, I think there are a couple of things to say. One is that I think we should all be braced for a little bit of a sort of curveball, big initiative from France. I'm not entirely clear that that will be in the Indo-Pacific. I think it could be on Iran, it could be on Afghanistan, but I think that Paris will very much feel that license has been given, if you like, for it to come up with a big diplomatic initiative of its own, where it won't feel quite the same obligations to consult as it might have done. Secondly, I think there will be, as I mentioned, this push on EU strategic autonomy. We have these discussions of what the EU is calling its strategic compass, which is basically a way of defining the Union's priorities in crisis management, capability development, and partnerships and resilience over the next 5 to 10 years. And this conversation is evolving, of course, at the same time as NATO is talking about its updated strategic concepts. And there is a real challenge here on making sure that those policy discussions remain fundamentally interlinked. Because remember, in December of this year, we have an Foreign Ministers NATO Council where we're meant to be issuing a sort of new declaration on EU-NATO cooperation. And these sort of, how we manage the diplomacy in the next coming months will be really critical for how far we can push the boat in December and how coordinated the NATO work on its policy priorities is alongside EU work. I mean, in terms of where the fallout is going to be felt, I mean, I wonder if I could just say 2 words on the UK-France bilateral relationship, because I think a lot of the fallout will be outside of the Indo-Pacific. There's no question that this is a complicated relationship where there is a host of different ways that the two countries can aggravate each other. There's a lot of sensitive stuff on the table at the moment that might sound very parochial, on fishing rights, on flexibility on the Northern Ireland Protocol, on small boats issues, on migrant return agreements. But this stuff should worry us beyond those who care about the sort of bilateral relations, because, just give one example. There was meant to be a defence ministerial between the UK and France that has been, I would presume, not cancelled, but postponed. But at that defence ministerial, the two sides were meant to be taking into consideration the move to the next phase of bilateral cooperation on a future cruise anti-ship weapon to replace the British Harpoon and the French Exocet. And that decision now gets pushed back. And so in other words, this sort of tit for tat, sort of cancelling summitry, and it does actually have material consequences. And I think to finish off on the sort of broader point of where the consequences will be felt in terms of the UK and French bilateral relationship, up until now, we're all used to a mantra that says, you know what, UK-French relations can be difficult, but actually, even through Brexit, the defence and the security component of that bilateral relationship has been one of the sort of more robust and reliable elements to the relationship. There's just too much on the table that we need to cooperate on. And if that's now brought into consideration, then that's not good for any of us. And it does signal a more bumpy ride in the future.
Ben, do you want to go over to you? My sense is over the last week that the German position has sort of shifted a little bit towards Paris, partly out of a sense of solidarity, but that you have said there remains deep divisions within the European Union in general over this question and the French response. But same question to you. If this discord is going to have a significant effect in policy terms, where is that discord going to be felt?
Thanks. Yeah, and I agree largely with Sarah. The discord will be mostly felt in the European theater. I mean, there has been this saying going around here in Berlin, you know, that the French approach to this, response to this, will be, you know, you ignore the Australians, you forgive the United States, and you punish the UK. And from my discussions within, you know, within the Berlin setting, there is quite some degree of concern over what, you know, also France will now bring into that NATO discussion that Sarah mentioned. I mean, NATO was going to have to come up with an answer, for instance, on the China question, which is an increasingly wicked problem for the alliance. And now there is an expectation, at least in some quarters here in Berlin, that France might torpedo that. And obviously, the other thing is that mentioning of the EU strategic autonomy. And there have been a whole set of smaller countries who now have raised concerns over, you know, asking basically, so what will the Germans do when the French are pushing positions on that EU strategic autonomy, which does seem to be exclusive of the United Kingdom, which seem to be exclusive of the United States, because that is certainly not something that they want to see. So this question of what EU strategic autonomy means, for most countries, including, I would still argue, also the new German government, if it then is the, you know, the traffic light, is to have that middle ground position and keep the United Kingdom and keep the United States involved in this whole big thing, which is, you know, European defense. So for these countries, EU strategic autonomy can only mean, within NATO, can only mean to bring and keep the United States and the United Kingdom engaged. And the concern really here is that France might torpedo some of those you know, steps towards ensuring that. And obviously, the Franco-Greek deal also raised quite some eyebrows as potentially one element in a French strategy that is not really conducive with what other European NATO allies would want to see, because it's clearly seen as rather counterproductive in dealing with an increasingly challenging Turkey. So long, short answer to your excellent question. I think I agree with Sarah. It's more within the European continent and European setting than in the Indo-Pacific.
Great. David, over to you. Same thesis, I suppose. So Tony Blinken has to go to Paris. He speaks excellent French. What should he say?
Yeah, that's a very good question. So I think that's what the discussion in Washington is all about. Is, gee, what are they going to say to the French? So I think it is going to be about the broader unity of the advanced democracies, the continued need for a dialogue around Europe, U.S. support. I think that the U.S. is going to take a soft line on this issue of EU capabilities versus NATO. I think that broadly in administration thinking, I think it's that any increment of increased capacity, military capacity in Europe is seen as positive. If it's done in the framework of the EU rather than in the framework of NATO, I don't think that's going to be seen as a problem by Washington. So I do think that the purpose here is to defuse the situation, continue to discuss areas of common interest, and those include the Indo-Pacific. There's no question about that. But I don't think there's going to be any kind of a mea culpa or any kind of a backtracking on the fundamentals of AUKUS.
Let me just ask you one more question before we, and others can chime in on this, and then we'll go straight to the questions. We've got a lot of them. But what does this episode tell us about Biden's approach to the Indo-Pacific? So you have different kind of centers of Washington's Asia policy. You have some of it that's driven on the military side by the Pentagon. You have Kurt Campbell as a very sort of high profile and dominant figure. We haven't yet got a US Indo-Pacific strategy, but looking at AUKUS and the other points that you mentioned, I mean, what can we glean from the way the US is going to try and develop an Indo-Pacific strategy from the way that AUKUS was conceived and the way it's been rolled out?
Yeah, so I do think that the main challenge here for the US and the Indo-Pacific remains the economic commercial dimension rather than the diplomatic or the military dimension. And as I was saying on this, I think the irony of China's move to initiate negotiations around joining CPTPP is that it's virtually impossible that China ever gets into CPTPP just because of the requirements of what it would have to do domestically to qualify. But the fact of its seeking membership, I think, could be a significant impetus here inside the administration to think about the need for a commercial dimension to US diplomacy and strategy in that part of the world. Now, that will not emerge overnight here, but I do think that the chances of initiating a discussion around these issues in the aftermath of the US midterm elections, which will be held in 13 months' time, has gone up as a result of this.
Okay, let's dive into some questions. So since you're talking on this subject, I'll bring in the question I mentioned from Corey Shaki, our former colleague and now at the American Enterprise Institute. Corey writes, the Biden administration countering Chinese coercion with military agreements seemed contrary to their preference for relentless diplomacy. Can Biden really coalesce Asian allies without compromising their foreign policy for the middle class? So this is the same point that you're making, which is, in the end, does the Biden administration have to junk its preference for a kind of middle class or worker-friendly trade policy in order to get back into this economic game? So let's deal with that, and then we'll go back to the security stuff in a minute. So David.
Yeah. So, I mean, there are two elements here. The first is the question of relentless diplomacy, and vis-a-vis China, I mean, it takes two to tango. So the Chinese view has been that U.S. policy has hardened substantially under Trump, but that the U.S. wants to negotiate on a handful of things, on nuclear issues and on climate issues, but that they don't accept, at least for now, this compartmentalization. So the quest for relentless diplomacy, as it refers to China, I think is on hold. There's not a pathway towards that in the near future. On the broader question of might the administration have to compromise. I think here that economic conditions and the success or failure of the administration on the infrastructure package and on its broader spending package will create, hopefully, a context of opportunity for it to be able to develop a domestic narrative around support for workers and middle-class Americans that will enable them to go back into these negotiations in a way that can produce a successful outcome. So yes, they may have to compromise a bit, but that's what politics and international diplomacy is all about, is finding compromises to enable greater goals.
One of the things you realize in diplomacy is it's a good idea to ask a question if your boss poses one. So we've got one of all of our respective bosses, John Shipman, who's the Director General of IISS. And John asked, this I think is a question for Sarah and Ewan in your own way. But John writes, the expectation in the UK was that it would get a good element of the nuclear propulsion work, which Australia thought would come from London. Is there a risk that during the 18-month period of design, much of the work ends up going to the US, with the result that the US itself feels gazumped by the US and disappointingly turned into the fifth wheel imagined by the French? So Ewan, do you want to talk about that? You highlighted that this originally, the concept here from the Australian side is that this would be an Australian-British submarine design, and that does appear to be changing. So there may be a little discord amongst the trio. Do you want to say that? And then Sarah, do you want to come in on that as well?
Sure. Yes, it is a risk, but it's too early to tell which way it's going to go. That's why part of AUKUS allowed itself such a generous consultation period of 18 months afterwards. I think in conscious awareness that there was going to be a difficulty around who would get the greater share of the work. Perhaps complicating that is Australia's own awareness, having learned the lesson of pursuing bespoke designs with a French nuclear model that was stripped out and supposed to be run on conventional diesel electric basis and fitted with a US combat system. That was almost a recipe for failure. So that may actually push the Australians to go off the shelf. And if they go off the shelf, then it's a winner takes all potentially for either the US or UK in terms of which submarine and reactor and combat system are furnished, because the Australians are acutely aware of the timeline here. And to relate this back to the Defence Strategic Update, one of the notable things about that was that it ended strategic warning time, a 10-year period in which Australia envisaged there would not be a materialized military threat. Now, that means that Australia defense planning is on the official basis that they could be in a conflict, armed conflict, by the end of this decade. And the nuclear submarines won't count in that, in a direct sense, and they won't be delivered. So that, yes, let me give way to Sarah, but I think Sarah has already prepared the ground nicely on this with her comments that it makes sense for a mitigation strategy from the UK's point of view to focus on the other elements, the quantum, cyber, and AI as well. And I think it's good that there's a broader agenda, because if it is a winner takes all on the nuclear propulsion side, that's going to leave an enormous vacuum. And the irony of ironies would be if the UK then ends up feeling itself as the sort of aggrieved party, having announced the baby, but then finding out that the wisdom of Solomon has not favored it in the choice.
Sarah, do you want to pick this up? And firstly, the same question from John, which is, is there a risk that this happy non-alliance sort of becomes a little more fractious? But the UK, in its own telling of this story, has suggested that it was principally responsible for the broadening out of the AUKUS concept, and in particular adding in these elements that Ewan just mentioned, the fancy new future technology, the quantum 6th generation AI and all the rest of it. So in addition to the risk that the UK ends up being sort of slightly left behind, do we have a sense yet of what this other technological sharing amounts to? Because it appears in the first instance to have been fairly thinly described. Do we have any sense at all of where the kind of rubber hits the road on the rest of the non-submarine technology sharing?
Thanks very much. I mean, I think the short answer to John's question is absolutely yes, there's the danger, but that's the reason in the talk that my few minutes that I gave at the outset, that I said that the UK would be taking nothing for granted, would be doubling down on its diplomacy bilaterally with Australia. I think the key point is, though, that there is, of course, a risk that the UK won't maximise benefits to the industrial cooperation. But I'm not too sure that even if that happens, that the UK will be left feeling aggrieved, because there is more to this deal, or at least the UK very much hopes there is more to this deal than simply, albeit very importantly, the design and procurement of submarines. And that's where James, your question in terms of, where the rubber hits the road on this. And I think that the UK won't be left feeling aggrieved because the agenda is deliberately designed, if you like, at the moment to be fairly broad, because this is where the opportunities sort of for partnership, I think you'll see the UK pushing. I mean, somebody's already mentioned a couple of times the Quad has come up. I mean, it's no secret that the UK has had a long-standing interest in making itself a more and more relevant and attractive partner to the Quad. And some of the work that we're talking about in this AUKUS deal, if actually the UK starts collaborating more closely with Australia and the US on these sorts of issues, I think probably do push the UK towards being a more attractive partner, albeit I accept fully David's point on the fact that the reticence for that is not coming from stateside, it's coming from the other side of the world. I mean, I think the other point from the UK that's interesting to watch, both in terms of how the US manage its European relations, how the Biden administration manage its European relations, but also how the UK protect equities, is that remember that the US and EU have just had their first meeting of the Trade and Technology Council. And whilst there's some sort of skepticism about what this might amount to, the bottom line is that you have 5 senior ministers overseeing 10 working groups on covering priority issues, 5 of them that consider the sort of intersection of national security and trade. And the UK's left out of that, obviously by its own choosing, by leaving the EU, but it's quite nervous about that body turning into some significant, not just rule sharing, rule making, but something more substantive in terms of cooperation that follows on issues like AI and quantum. And so I think that the deliberate design of the AUKUS deal to be submarines as the crux around which a whole load of other stuff can be packaged is also sort of particularly interesting to the UK because of its sort of concern to reinsure that it isn't left out of these discussions which are going to take place in the EU-US Trade and Technology Council, but also, of course, as Ewan's pointed out, as the Quad takes this sort of almost deliberate decision, if you like, to make itself sort of to take on regional capacity building issues, discussions about vaccine role, regional stability. And as the Quad sort of builds itself out on these sort of things, again, if the UK is not involved in the Quad, the UK is not involved in the Trade and Technology Council, where is it plugging in? And I think it will very much hope that AUKUS won't just be the absolute hard end of the alliance, but will be plugging in on some of these issues as well.
I was going to turn next to a question from Paris, but we're all talking about the Quad, so let's stick there. We've got 4 or 5 different questions about the Quad. So Samayak Jain, Sahil Sharma, Aman Singh, a few others, all ask the same question, which is, what does this all mean from the Quad? So we've heard Ewan say the Quad appears to be taking on a broader messaging function. Sarah was just echoing that. David, maybe I could go to you with this. Where does the US want to take the Quad? I mean, does it, in a sense, see AUKUS as a precedent for a Quad that becomes much more forceful, potentially have more military cooperation? Does Kirk Campbell think the Quad should continue with this much broader role in vaccines and other areas? What's your sense of where this goes and what we can read out of the AUKUS decision?
Yeah, so I think the Quad as originally conceived, I think was how do you get India into a collaborative, cooperative role in a huge, wide range of issues, while not challenging the longstanding notion of Indian non-alignment. So the Quad is all about India, and it's all about how you can build an alliance-like relationship in the absence of a formal alliance. And I think that so far it's succeeding at that. I think that India, despite growing frictions with China, India wants the Quad very, very much to be a multiple area-focused organization, and the Quad partners are fine with that. But I do believe at the end of the day that there is a strategic notion here for the Quad, and that is getting as much of an alliance-like relationship from India without challenging the historic notion of Indian non-alignment.
So, Ewan, two fingers to Ewan, go on.
Just wanted to add that I think the Indian reaction to AUKUS is itself also interesting, and the geography of AUKUS. If AUKUS is going to be about developing an Australian nuclear submarine capability, but also in the lead up to that, extending basing arrangements to the United States and potentially the UK to start sending their nuclear submarines to Australia, that will all be Indian Ocean based. There's only one submarine base at the moment outside Perth. So that helps India. India wants that vacuum to be filled. If there's going to be a conglomeration of naval power, AUKUS might take some of the slack away from the Quad on that, but in a way that India would be supportive of.
Ben, you just put two fingers up as well. You can come down on that one, but I wanted to bring us back to the kind of question of European discord, which is your pet subject for today. So Marianne Perron-Doise from the Institute for Strategic Studies in Paris asks, there's a strong ambiguity in AUKUS given overlapping US security commitments in Asia, which seems to draw a line between allies, some of whom deserve, in inverted commas, capability sharing, and those who do not. So how can we continue to maintain the trust that is at the heart of any alliance and security partnership under these conditions? So Ben, what's your sense of this? I mean, you've been reasonably supportive of AUKUS, but this is a reasonable question to ask, I think. So how would you counter that? And then you had your two fingers up on the preceding point.
Yes, thank you. I mean, it's an excellent question. My response would be, I guess twofold. One is, in this specific circumstance of AUKUS, where the United States, for the first time, for a very long time, agreed to share highly sensitive technology. This could have, in my view, only been Australia to be quite honest because it is not just part of the 5 eyes, but you can also say, you can say it's part of the 3 eyes, namely the UK, the United States, and Australia. And for that matter, I think Australia, it could only have been Australia that had access to this kind of technology. I would also say that I don't think that necessarily the conclusion can be drawn that the United States basically is separating allies and partners in those that it will likely defend and those it would not. In other words, I think the willingness of the United States is to support its key allies in the Indo-Pacific, whether that is Japan, whether that is Australia, whether that is South Korea, whether there's a quasi-ally, and we can discuss this, such as Taiwan. I think the United States would support and extend its security guarantees to those existing allies, just as it would probably, or highly likely, honor its security and defense commitment within NATO. I do not detect any willingness of the United States to move away from those. I mean, I would always come back and because France is not really my stronghold, and turn the question around and ask the French participants in this webinar of whether France would really have seriously contemplating sharing highly sensitive nuclear technology with Australia. I mean, after the decision was taken, France indicated, or some French interlocutors indicated, that if Australia would have only asked, then of course France would have been willing to share that technology. But I'm doubtful that would have actually been the case. So I wouldn't draw the conclusion from the AUKUS decision as a proof that the United States is sort of dividing its allies, even though, yes, when it comes to nuclear sharing of that kind, Australia certainly, because of all the reasons we just discussed, was the one partner to go to.
Okay, 2-finger from David. Then I've got a couple of questions about regional reaction from Ewan as we canter towards our closing in about 10 minutes' time. David.
Yeah, I just want to say that I don't think it's a new phenomenon that not all U.S. alliance relationships are created equal, and so I do think that it's pretty long standing that there have been various arrangements with different allies, and I do think that very much part of the Biden administration's approach is a flexible viewpoint on the nature of alliances and what's shared among allies.
Great. Ewan, a couple of questions specifically directed at you. So Alex Spillans, who works for DFAT, the Australian Foreign Office in Canberra, you mentioned reaction in Jakarta. Considering Southeast Asian non-aligned tendencies, to what extent may public statements be different from private perspectives? I'm presuming here that the gist of this question is that the countries are more alarmed than they have said in their public statements, but I suppose it's plausible it could be the other way, that actually they're more relaxed and they simply felt like they have to say this. And then Ewan, a sort of second and related question from Boram Kwan here in Singapore about South Korea. What are the implications of this for hedging partners of the US like ROK, and what lessons should be learned? And then there's a kind of catch-all question, which I'm not going to give to you because it's too much, but any of the rest of you might want to come in about China. So Donald Emerson, who I'm going to guess is the Donald Emerson who runs the Asia Center at Stanford, asks, can we guess what China's reaction to this will be? So I'll let David, Sarah, and Ben cogitate on that and see if they can say something, and let you in talk about Southeast Asia and Korea.
Thanks, James. Thanks for the questions. On the Southeast Asian reaction, I think the public part a lot of it is going to be about the issue of ASEAN centrality, and that what they're basically seeking is reassurance that AUKUS isn't a zero-sum proposition that's going to take away their convening role within regional security dialogue. And I think that's fairly easy for Australia to do. I think there's no appetite that I could see for AUKUS to be expanded anytime soon. It needs time to settle. It has enough on its plate amongst the three to do with these very challenging long-range technical issues. And the Australian, the nuclear submarine deal is going to be the main benchmark of its success or failure. I think at that public messaging level, Australia needs to say that it doesn't change the commitment to ASEAN, it doesn't change the commitment to the five-power defense arrangements or any of the other mini-lateral offshoots in the region. That should be a fairly straightforward diplomatic task. My view of the regional reactions is it very much depends who you're speaking to, which part of the government, which individual. It all shakes out differently. The security and defense establishments, I think, might be rather more amenable to the strategic logic of Australia requiring a long-range submarine, which may even take the fight further away from Southeast Asia. Those diesel-powered nuclear submarines, those diesel-powered submarines in the current inventory are made to operate at shorter range, more likely to sit at the bottom of Indonesian straits and pose more of a problem there than nuclear submarines, which could potentially range as far north as Northeast Asia or Taiwan and operate there for extended periods. However, I am basically sympathetic to the anxiety across the region that what's the end goal of this? What's the extrapolation from this? I don't think that one can dismiss the nuclear proliferation question as easily as it seems. In a technical sense, yes, I think you can, because Australia has approached this from the viewpoint of a single fuel load within a highly enriched reactor that can be done without the need of a supporting nuclear industry. That'll be a challenge, but I mean, it's possible. And that could then be ring-fenced from weapons proliferation. But I think that doesn't answer the broader strategic question, which is, if Australia is in the game of deterring China, and Australia is a non-nuclear power, in 20 years' time, are we going to be revisiting this question of nuclear weapons capability? I don't say that lightly, but I don't think it can be dismissed for the same reason that in 2016, when Australian defense officials were earnestly saying that they didn't need a nuclear-powered submarine, and 5 years later now, we're at a very different spot. And I think if the regional security environment continues to deteriorate rapidly and China bears its teeth in a more aggressive military sense, then I think that is a genuine worry. Very quickly on the South Korean question, because I know I've gone on. A hedging ally, I think, is a very appropriate way to think of Korea. As David said, all alliances, the US alliances are not equal. They're all bespoke. Korea is almost a boutique alliance in the sense that it is not oriented from the South Korean viewpoint towards China. It's about dealing with North Korea. There is a very interesting comparison point because South Korea has developed a ballistic missile, submarine launched ballistic missile capability. It's the only country that has one without nuclear weapons, whereas Australia is vying to be the only operator of nuclear submarines without nuclear weapons. And in my book, I think the higher risk from a weapons proliferation standpoint is probably South Korea, because that's where the trend line points. and there are existing plans to develop nuclear-powered submarines. So I think that will probably be the next country likely to follow, but it won't be from a viewpoint of trying to leverage UK or US technology. I think the Koreans have learned the hard lesson that you do it on your own.
Now, we have any number of China experts at the IISS who watch the sort of the smoke signals from Beijing. These Mandarin speakers are not on this panel, but I'm going to ask the three that we do have to see if they have any thoughts on how this might look from Beijing. Sarah, do you have thoughts on this?
Yeah, just a quick one, that this has all the ingredients of a classic sort of opportunity for misinformation, disinformation campaign. Basically, what you have is the potential to misrepresent this deal as something that militarizes the region, that forces allies and partners to take sides. There's plenty of material to work with. You have the opportunity to sow sort of mistrust. You know, will the submarines really be delivered on time? Will the UK really get what it wants? What does this mean for the Quad? How badly have France been treated? And it's not just against working with the sort of possible opponents of the deal. You can see it already being played out in some of the sort of lines, or even stoking US frustrations with French reactions, because ultimately it doesn't really matter as long as you sow some sort of confusion and discourse and you derail efforts to create more smoother cooperation on this. This is a win. And so, you know, for example, you can sort of already see some pushback, I would say, but David will know better, in Washington about the outrage with which France is behaving when it worked with Germany to take full opportunity of the window before the Biden administration came in to follow its own, what it perceived as its own national interests by signing the comprehensive agreement on investment, fully against what it understood the US would like, and with limited consultation. So I think I just finished with sort of that broad point. And then, of course, aware of this, what in Europe can we do to push back? And clearly one of the issues here has been about sort of strategic transparency. But I guess that one of the things, the corners that we're now boxed into, is that nobody in Europe is going to dare to offend the French for at least a little while to come. And so if I was sitting in the German MOD at the moment and I was looking at the Tiger aircraft and the project for cooperation on Tiger 3, and I was looking at the Australia decision at the start of this year to effectively bin its Tigers and purchase Apaches for its helicopter fleet, and I'd be thinking about whether I wanted to follow Australia down that line as well. I mean, I pretty much can't right now, can I? So it's good news, I guess, for France from some respects, in that we better all behave ourselves for at least a little while.
We've got 2 minutes to go, so I'm going to give Ben Schreier and David Gordon 1 minute each, starting with Ben and then with David, and no more than 1 minute because we end on time at the IISS, just to give a final thought or a final point before we let people go about their evenings, lunchtimes or mornings. Ben, you first.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, on China, very quickly, I agree with Sarah on the short-term implications, but a short-term opportunity for China, but long-term, I think China was surprised, and unpleasantly surprised, because this, turns the US-Australia alliance into a much more operational alliance, and also provides Australia with a future capability to provide Japan with much needed relief in the Northeast Asian theater. So this certainly cannot be in China's long-term strategic interest, whatever the short-term opportunity is. Quick point on South Korea. I think it's interesting that the United States, there's an interesting comparison, another interesting comparison to the one that you drew, which is that the Biden administration has dropped any US opposition to the ranges of ROK ballistic missiles. And so I think what we might see here is sort of a new era of conditional proliferation on part of the United States, where you give sort of either direct or more tacit approval and support to key allies to arm themselves and to back up and backfill for some of those limited US possibilities and capabilities in this new era of strategic competition. So I think that is really interesting, the South Korean bit from that angle as well. Thank you.
David, final 1 minute to you before we wrap up.
I mean, I think Beijing is going to double down a little bit, but but not overwhelmingly on their strategy of just building up defense cooperation, mill-to-mill relationships more broadly in Southeast Asia. But here, I mean, you know, right now, China has this enormous tension between its domestic politics and its external policy, and they've not, frankly, been managing that very effectively. And so I would not assume that China is going to find a very effective way out of these very large dilemmas that AUKUS creates for them.
Thank you. The interesting thing about a deal of this magnitude is that its effects will take not weeks, not months, but probably years to be properly understood. But I feel like I can thank my panelists for having a good crack at it 1 month on our tour of the allies, as it were, and their European sort of discord was useful and interesting. So thank you very much. You can find more analysis on AUKUS at the IISS website and through the publications that we produce in our office here in Singapore, in Ben's in London, in Ben's in Berlin rather, in London and in the United States. So with that, thank you very much for watching, and we'll look forward to seeing you here again soon. Many thanks and good night.